Okay, so I'm Paul Kovac from ICLR. Welcome, everybody. John, since you did our very, very first seminar, earthquakes have always been really, really popular issues for our industry to come together and talk about. So it's terrific that we have, again, a very strong attendance in person and many, many people joining online, so thank you all for participating. I'm really delighted to have Ross Stein here to talk with us today. Ross is with the U.S. Geological Survey, one of the world's most preeminent geologists looking at earthquake risk. He's going to talk today about the global earthquake model. Ross is going to have John say a few words at the start to set the whole stage up. If I can introduce John Adams from the Canadian Geological Survey. John is somebody that everybody here should be very familiar with. John's spoken to us a few times and works with our industry very, very carefully in terms of looking at Canadian earthquake risk. So I'm going to have John Adams start us off with just a few words to start. John.
Thank you. Where's the camera I'm looking towards?
We're not actually filming. We're going to show the slides.
Okay, well, I could have pretty much sat down again. I'm John Adams. I represent the Government of Canada, and we do the National Seismic Hazard Maps for Canada. These are the ones that go into the building code, and they underlie the design levels for new buildings within Canada. We have a real interest in not having earthquake disasters in Canada, and the best way of doing that is making sure the buildings are well designed before the earthquakes happen. So when you come to do earthquake losses in Canada, a lot of it is based on models, some from commercial companies, but the building code is the one that actually covers the design of the buildings in Canada. We have significant earthquake potential losses on the west coast due to mega earthquakes like the one in Japan. Cascadia magnitude 9 happens about every 600 years. Last one was 300 years. The chance of it happening in the next 50 years, in that 50-year window, is of 10% or so. But, you know, it could happen tomorrow, and it's always better to be ready for that. We're sitting here, or standing here in Toronto, and this is an area of moderate hazard. It's not quite as low as places like Winnipeg, but it is appreciable. You'll appreciate there's a lot of property at risk here in Toronto. The biggest earthquake that's shaken Toronto they've been distant earthquakes in the magnitude 6 range, where we think it possible that magnitude 6-ish earthquakes quite close to the city could happen. And that would be quite a large urban disaster. Now, the business, of course, is making the estimates in terms of probability. So when I wave my hands and talk about high hazard and low hazard, moderate hazard, that's not very useful. In the end, you need to know what the probability of a given event and what the losses are going to be. And that's where the earthquake models come into play. So I guess I would say that on behalf of the Government of Canada, we have an interest in making sure that Canadians are protected. And part of that is being ready ahead of time, having mitigation things in place, including good, strong buildings, having the emergency planning that will respond quickly, and also to some degree there's the whole issue of the fiscal requirement of a disaster like that, which for a Vancouver event is in the range of, 50 to 100 billion probably, and for Montreal I think I've heard figures in the around 15 billion-ish range. So these are relatively large. They're not something that would be trivial. And so planning for it, understanding the consequences, understanding the probabilities is important. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, John. So if I can turn over to Ross. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Paul, for this invitation and for this opportunity to speak to you. Very, very fortunate that some of the leading lights in earthquake science and earthquake engineering, Gail Atkinson, Michele Calve from the U Center in Italy, and John Adams are here with me for perhaps moral support and quite a bit of understanding. This is a typical building throughout the world. And the property of a building built as a stack of cubes is that no matter how well it's bolted to the ground, no matter how strong its columns and beams, this building is held up only by its corners, and it's only as strong as its corners. Now, in an earthquake, for the most part, we're shaking side to side, and you can see that this building is very weak at the corners. A lot of earthquakes involve vertical accelerations, and again, you can see how weak this is, and all earthquakes involve torsion. And again, this building is weak. If any one of these corners breaks during that shaking, this building could very well fall down. This is the exact same building, except we've just snapped in these little triangular corner braces to strengthen those corners. Now look. Nothing. This building costs just 5% more to build than this building. And it's the difference between a disaster and no problem at all. It's an embarrassingly small difference between these two buildings. And I want to emphasize that a cube, in church we'd say a tetrahedron, has no structural integrity. And so it has to be supported by the corners. Now, in a reinforced concrete building, perhaps such as this, although this seems to be older still, rather than producing little triangles like this or shear walls, let's say we have panels that provide that same triangle, what will happen is there is rebar. There is steel, ribbed steel that goes through the columns and the beams, flares out in all directions at the corner, and is wrapped for particularly extra strength. But the problem is we can't see if they're there and if they're adequate. Now let me show you one more thing. A typical building around the world, to recover the cost of building the building, the contractor will use the bottom floor for retail space, so think big picture windows, or maybe parking, or maybe a movie theater, or a big lobby. So I'm just going to take out the strengthening on the bottom floor of this building. And this is what engineers call a soft first-story building. And you can see already what is happening to this building. This is the worst building you can build. It's top-heavy. It's weak at the knees. And in an earthquake, a building like this breaks at the bottom, and then all the other floors fall at 32 feet per second and implode successively on the way up. And this is the most common failure mode for buildings around the world, easily fixed by strengthening that bottom floor. And if you think about it, if you ever see retrofit older buildings, you will see huge triangular steel braces. You've all seen them in San Francisco, maybe even here. Let me tell you a story. I've studied for many years the sequence of falling domino earthquakes in Turkey on the North Anatolian Fault. And after the 1999 Izmit earthquake, a magnitude 7.6 event that took about 20,000 lives, I was accompanying a film crew that was interviewing survivors. And we met a young professional couple, the Erkmans, who had a 6-year-old son, and they were living on the second story of a building like this. And for their wedding present, they had been given a iron 4-poster bed. And when the earthquake occurred, their son was in the next room, and the couple were in their bed. These stories above them slammed down on their bed, but the iron frame kept the stack of stories above them from crushing them. They had just enough room to breathe, but not even to get out of the bed. And they were stuck there in the dark, and the posts of the bed had gone through the wooden floor. And eventually Mr. Erkman was able to pry open, as he was lying there, pry open some pieces of the wood. And he found with his hand in the darkness a PVC tube, and he broke it and water came out. And because of that, they were able to stay hydrated for the 60 hours it took until they were rescued. When they were rescued, they learned that their son had died. We heard this story, and we went to the site of the building. And next door to it was a building that was identical, except it was still partially standing. And I could see a huge crack in one of these joints. And I said, you know, that crack is wide enough I could get my arm in there. I want to feel the rebar, how much rebar is in there in the caging, to see how well built this building was. And the film crew had a hydraulic lift, and they put me on the lift, brought me up there. I stuck my hand in, and I pulled out a hunk of styrofoam. That's what was in there. The world would be a safer place if concrete were translucent. That's the problem. It's very subversive. You don't know if your building is strong or weak unless you go to extraordinary lengths to find out. So this is the world that we have inherited, a world made of stacks of cubes, more often than not, inadequately built, and the difference between them is so pathetically small. And what we must do as a society is help people move from this to the strong buildings. And that's why we founded 4 years ago the global earthquake model that I'd like to introduce to you. Let me start by something really simple. Let me just show you global population. This is the population of Europe and North Africa. Until I saw this image, I didn't realize that Egypt is not a country. It's just a river. It's a river of humanity in inky blackness. I also discovered that no one's home in Switzerland. Now, if we were to put on this map cities at risk, megacities, cities with 1 million or more people at risk to earthquakes, you'll see some of the usual suspects: Tehran, Istanbul, Algiers. Now, what I want to do is remove those for a minute and flip this map over to the population density of Asia. Same population density scale. And now you see the problem. And now if we begin to put up cities at risk, you see 10 times the number of cities with huge populations that are at risk for earthquakes. Look at eastern China. Look at Java, the most populated place on Earth, right up against a subduction zone where we can have magnitude 9 earthquakes. Look at India. Let me zoom in on India. You may not know that India has been in a slow-motion car crash into Tibet for 40 million years. It's moving so slowly that in this crash, the engine has already been pushed into the driver's seat, but the people in the back seat don't even know that there's a crash in progress. And the front fender of that car crash are these red ellipses, the sites of 8 to 9, magnitude 8 to 9 earthquakes over the last millennium. The problem is virtually no great earthquake has occurred in several generations, so there's no cultural memory of this threat. And that problem is hugely compounded by the fact that the Indian government must supply power and water to the 400 million people living in the Ganges Plain to feed its economic miracle. So they are, if you like, they have a very strong disincentive to be candid about the risks of building hydroelectric facilities in the fault-laced Himalaya foothills. The situation here is as if I took all the population of the United States, increased it by 50%, and put them all along the San Andreas Fault, and put them all in buildings like the one on the right here. That is the loaded gun that we have in northern India, and people are not going to get the straight story from their government. That's why we need to have an independent, authoritative source of seismic risk information for the world, without which we cannot move forward. Only one relatively moderate earthquake has occurred on this boundary in recent memory. That's the Pakistan, just at magnitude 7.6. It took 80,000 lives. This is Bacalo Hill at the site of that earthquake. 1,600 people alone lost their lives on this hill. Every single building on that hill has been destroyed. And if we move to another part of the world where the risk is equally high, South America, you can see that the population, which is again the white, is engulfed by earthquakes. It is another almost pathological situation. The population is where the earthquakes are in the subcontinent of South America. And when we zoom in on a major city, a megacity in South America, such as Bogota, 6 million people living cheek by jowl against an active fault. So this is why, in our judgment, we need to have an organization which addresses this problem. And GEM's mission is to build the world's first seismic risk model. And by By risk, I mean not just the likelihood of an earthquake occurring, not just the likelihood of the shaking that earthquake will produce, but the consequences of that shaking in terms of deaths, dollars, and damage. Because if we want to speak to finance ministers, mayors, the people who make a difference in this society, we must speak their language, not just our language. We're not speaking in peak ground accelerations. We have to explain what the consequences are of an earthquake and how, if you're the mayor of Istanbul, those consequences might be changed if you retrofitted hospitals or schools. And until we give that individual tools, they have every right to ignore the hazard. In other words, nobody has got enough money to completely solve this problem. So we have to say, what would be the impact of retrofitting schools versus hospitals? Or maybe you should have a catastrophe bond on the market, and after the earthquake, you get an infusion of cash. The person needs to know where the money is best spent to produce results. That's what we have to provide them. You know, it's incredible. If you want to buy term life insurance, there's thousands of sites on the web where you can figure out what your best deal is. But I get offered earthquake insurance because I live 3 kilometers from the San Andreas every year. Okay, here it is, $3,000. But I don't have any tools to decide, is this a good deal? What should I be doing? So, of course, most people ignore it. It's just a big number without understanding the consequences. We are sophisticated enough, and the world can be made more sophisticated to use that information if it's provided. We have no illusions that models and maps change behavior, but we are certain that if we don't build these, people will ignore the problem. People will have an excuse to ignore the problem. Here are GEM's principles. They're simple. Raise risk awareness. That's the most important thing. And if we do so, we'll be promoting preparedness, building codes, and financial risk transfer. There is another aspect of this, aside from the humanitarian issues that are very important, which is that it's our contention that if you build sophisticated seismic hazard models in California and Japan and Canada, you simply won't have covered enough territory to learn in any reasonable amount of time if you're doing it right or wrong, or if you could improve it. Put another way, it's essentially untestable. This is the Achilles heel of my world. In a sense, we put out, I work at the USGS, we put out these statistics of the likelihood of earthquakes, and I'm in the best racket in town because it's all quantified and you can't prove me wrong. Perfect, right? The only way to figure out how to do this right is to do it globally. Only then will we have enough large earthquakes in a short amount of time that we can establish, are the earthquakes occurring at the frequency and where we think they are, and are their consequences what we think they are? So scientifically, there's an enormous benefit from building a global model that all of us in the room will benefit from, because in the insurance industry, you people are putting the money down on the numbers that we're producing. GEM's elements are really just 4. At the heart, the beating heart of GEM is the OpenQuake software engine, our attempt to produce state-of-the-art, high-quality, sophisticated software that is being taught around the world, and we hope will standardize the process of producing seismic risk analyses. We're building the global data sets without which we feel we can improve seismic hazard, and all of this will be available on the OpenQuake portal starting in 2014. Now, one of the very exciting things about GEM is that we're a public-private partnership. GEM is a nonprofit foundation headquartered in Pavia, Italy, launched by the OECD, but we are supported by a constellation of companies and countries with a great deal of involvement by non-governmental organizations on the right. So these companies are doing something, are really courageous, because they are making information available for the public good, and in a competitive world, that takes courage. And the countries that are standing alongside these companies are also making an enormous contribution. I might add here, you do not see Canada's flag. Easily rectified. The World Bank, the UN are very, very important players in this and helping us build this model. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would a company participate in a project like this that is building information for the public good? What is the business value for them? And let me just let them answer for themselves. Let me just show you Rowan Douglas's view from Willis Re. And I think you can look at this list and see a lot of things that probably make sense to you as well. Perhaps the most provocative statement is the one at the bottom, that models create and consume capital, and the OpenQuake model can play that role as well. And you can see many other ways in which GEM can be a rising tide that lifts all boats. Basically, if people do not believe they're at risk, they're not going to protect themselves. They're not going to build better. They're not going to insure. So this ability of a group that's independent of insurance companies and governments to provide this information makes the risk credible. And in that sense, we're in this together. Here's the view of Matt Jones from Zurich. Zurich Insurance Group is another founding sponsor of GEM. You can see that we are not intending to replace the role of proprietary vendor companies, but we have an enormous amount to add to the picture. And you might have seen that AIR Worldwide is one of our founding sponsors, so they're welcome in as well. Now, I mentioned that the data sets that GEM is gathering are crucial to the ability to improve probabilistic seismic hazard assessment. This is a very large investment, about a $12 million investment of GEM's. We've spent about $7 million on the software. We have about a $5 million budget a year. And I want to just focus on the hazard data sets because they're finished. And so I'm talking about material that is in the bag and I believe changes the landscape for seismic hazard analysis. So historical earthquakes, basically what GEM is trying to do is produce a millennial record of earthquakes, a century record of instrumentally recorded earthquakes, and a decade record from geodetically measured strain. This very long-term and short-term picture that are complementary to each other. So here is our global historical set of large earthquakes over the last 900 years. And just to zoom in on Indonesia, you can see that the standard reference catalog today being used by all the vendors is the NOAA catalog. It's their significant earthquake database. And that's what it shows for Indonesia on the left, and this is what is in the GEM database. In the Himalaya foothills, we have 6 times the number of earthquakes as that database. So we believe we have obsoleted that database. And this isn't just a set of earthquakes with locations and magnitudes. It's a set of vetted, published studies in which the people have brought all these studies together and have selected the study which they feel best represents the data. Instrumental earthquakes. This is a huge job. And here's an example of what it produced. All large earthquakes in the first half of the century were located without computers. And so everybody knew that what we needed to do was to relocate, in terms of magnitude, location, and depth, all of the instrumentally recorded earthquakes in the 20th century. But it's a huge job because it means collecting all of those paper seismograms, digitizing those, and putting them through one computer. Everybody knew it needed to be done. Nobody wanted to spend the money. We did. $1 million project. And they assembled just a vault of paper records that would fill this room to the top, and they were going to automate the digitizing process. When they pulled them out of the boxes, they fell apart in their hands. So that's how much longer they would have lasted. They were hand digitized. So 1 million phase records were digitized to produce this database. And again, this obsoletes its predecessor, which was called the Centennial Catalog, in part because the people who built the Centennial Catalog built this too. The difference is they had resources. We're using new modern techniques. One of the things that's interesting here is to consider that in all the models of Mexico, it's assumed that the largest earthquake that could strike was about 8.5. In all the models of Chile, we're assuming 9.5.
Do you see anything in this that would lead to that conclusion? There are a lot of judgments we're making which are unfounded. And the only way to make them right is for this global view. If we zoom in on the Caribbean and look at the difference between the old catalog and the new, you can see, for example, that there were earthquakes all across Central America, and now they're all in Guatemala. You can see a blur of earthquakes here, and now it's very crisp lines. You can also see that difference here. You can see that there were nothing near Puerto Rico, and now there are quite a few. So this is what you gain from this painstaking work. Here is that impact of India into Tibet. You can see that the earthquakes are not just along the bumper, but extend well into India. India is basically, Asia is flowing away from the impactor of India. This is a very highly active region here, centered on Myanmar. We can zoom in. And one of the other things that GEM is doing is trying to build the world's first inventory of active faults. So we can associate those earthquakes with fault limits. Look, it is almost ludicrous. There is not a seismologist in the world who wouldn't agree with the statement, earthquakes occur on faults, big earthquakes occur on big faults. So you would think we would have in our back pocket an inventory of the world's active faults. And we have none. This is very difficult data to gather together because it's a matter of people walking on the ground and doing a lot of individual work. It's not standardizable. It's not digitizable in the same way. We are assembling because if we do not know where the world's active faults are, particularly around major urban cities, we're never going to get this right. And the most important faults of all are the subduction zones. We're using the USGS slab 1.0. And this raises another issue for Canada in particular. John mentioned the occurrence rate of magnitude 9 earthquakes. Now, anywhere else in the world that you go to, if you have one magnitude 9 every 600 years, you should have 10 magnitude 8s in 600 years. The historical record, or the prehistoric record of the Cascadia subduction zone doesn't seem to show that. Is it really different, or is this a data problem? The answer really can't just be had from Cascadia. We need to look at the world subduction zones as a whole. This subduction zone, as we know, the Japanese thought could produce no larger than an 8.2, and it just had a 9. So we better recognize that we need this global view. The Japanese learned, if it needed relearning, that no country is an island. That even though they had 6,000 kilometers of subduction zones along the border, it wasn't enough to figure out what their largest earthquake could be. This subduction zone here has never produced anything larger than a 7.5. Does that mean it can't produce a 9 that would launch a tsunami that would whack Taiwan, the Philippines, and parts of the coast of China? We don't know. But we better study that. We better see, is there anything unique about this? And if not, we cannot just base it on its very short historical record. Now, one of the scientifically very exciting opportunities created by GEM is to use a new method to try to understand where the world's earthquakes can be, and it's the measurement of global strain. So here is a map from the western U.S. of the strain measured by GPS receivers. So if you just think of the Earth as a stiff slab of rubber, and you're shearing it, that rubber gets distorted, so the displacements change. And so this is simply a measure of the strain from a bunch of GPS observations on the ground. Now, if this were actually representative of earthquakes, it should be correlated with the rate of earthquakes in the same area, and it is. And here we have a very, very good earthquake catalog, where we're measuring very small earthquakes, unlike most places of the world. And that means that if we can measure strain, we've gone a long way toward understanding where earthquake hazard is, and we're not dealing with ancient data. The strain is all measured in the last decade. So we now have created a global strain rate model. So here is the entire Cordillera from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, all uniformly cataloged. So in other words, we really can compare the strain rate in Chile and Mexico and Canada. And so this ability to take this global view will be very important in understanding where earthquakes occur. And here is Asia. You can see the very high red belt where Asia crashes into Tibet, and you can pick out individual faults here. I showed you at the beginning of the talk Java, this super populated area, and you can see this super high strain associated with that extremely vulnerable population. Somewhere on this map, you are probably looking at the site of the million-death earthquake that we will experience in all likelihood in our lifetime. So we need to do this. We need to produce such a model. If we zoom in on Eurasia, this area here, and we superimpose that strain data with the last 100 years of earthquakes, you can see they're correlated. The black dots are occurring where the red colors are, and the black dots stay out of the blue colors. So that's very encouraging that, yes, this strain data is quite important. But you can also see that there are places, like where the Himalayas, where it's a lot redder than there are earthquakes. And I mentioned to you that we know from the historical record it's been much more active than it has been in the last 100 years. So that makes sense. And you can see other places where the earthquake record of the last 100 years is simply insufficient to tell us what could happen next. And that's why we need these combinations, why we need strain, the instrumental record, and the historical record. If we zoom in on one country, yes?
Just your footnote at the bottom. I get why we don't know the Himalayas, because people aren't there. I don't know if they're wrong, but why Greece?
Why Greece?
Why only recorded Greek earthquakes?
So here, there are a lot of earthquakes in parts of Greece where we have very, very high strains. But still, the strain rate is higher than the earthquake rate. So the strain rate over the last 10 years is higher than the rate we would assume based on the 100 years of earthquakes. Now, there were great subduction earthquakes in the historical record. There's one in 365 AD. So perhaps the last 100 years has been relatively light on earthquakes compared to the long-term average. So that's what the conclusion I would draw here. Not that this is somehow a forecast, a predictive ability, but simply that 100 years is too short to capture the long-term earthquake rates, except in places where things are happening really, really fast. So great question. Thank you for asking. So if we zoom in on Iran, again, we can see that the earthquakes generally correlate with strain, but there are some red zones there, such as Tehran, where there haven't been a lot of earthquakes. And most of these are associated with very large populations. So this is troubling. It means that in all likelihood, the last 100 years of earthquakes in Iran doesn't actually indicate how high the hazard is in Tehran. And I can tell you that Tehran is built exclusively by buildings like the one on the right, or actually, since I removed the support for the one on the left, both of those buildings are basically what you would find here. So this is how we created the data sets that we believe are essential to move forward. And we believe that these are going to be a gift to all of science so that people can use these to better understand earthquake occurrence. Now, I mentioned that these data sets are one element of GEM, and the other, the beating heart, is OpenQuake. And I want to just show you a little bit about the software that we've built. It's got an engine, a powerful engine, tools to create the data sets one needs, tools to bring in inventory data, fragility data, whatever data that you're bringing to bear. And it's fast, runs on a cluster, a cloud, or a laptop in a stripped-down way so that it can be used by people in the developing world. We've taught this in many developing countries already, but with the proper kind of cluster, it's quite fast, and it has beautiful visualization tools so that a person can explore the data and understand the data. Here's an example of the ability to show population density in two different color scales associated with urban population and rural population. This is the dwelling fractions based on the kind of reinforced concrete or whatever that's used. Now, all of us who are in the earthquake community, I said over the last several years, there's actually been a lot of combat in this this business. There's been a lot of pushback. And I think what happened was that Tohoku earthquake, the magnitude 9, where the country that is the best monitored, that spends the most money, got surprised, so surprised. I mean, the difference between an 8.2 and a 9 is a factor of 20. So the earthquake that occurred was 20 times larger than what they expected. And I believe that subverted a lot of confidence in the whole prospect of making probabilistic seismic hazard assessments, justified or not. And that's exploded into the community in terms of discussions about, okay, what are we doing right and wrong, and is this really something that we should be supporting? And I think this debate matters to all of us in the room. It should matter to insurers as much as it does to scientists, because you're basing your business on these probabilistic methods. GEM's approach to this problem is to say, okay, let's take the warring parties, bring them to a mountaintop for 3 days, and figure out what kind of tests and steps we need to take to solve these problems. John was involved in one of these groups. This is a group of people who were focused on hazard assessment in the slow continental regions of the world, and it included some of our chief critics, the whole idea. And I should just mention, we take a blood oath in these meetings. The idea is you can make any kind of comment you want, you can argue for your point of view as much as you want, but you must also explain the weaknesses in your point of view, the doubts in your own point of view. So everybody can be as vociferous as they need to, as long as they're completely open. And I promise you that changes the dialogue completely. Here's another one that was focused on the fast deforming areas of the world, such as the San Andreas and subduction zones. Okay, Mark may not be an angel up there, but in other words, we're not going to worry about good guys and bad guys. We're going to get together. We're not going to circle the wagons. We're going to have these discussions, and out of these discussions come tests and activities to try to do a better job. And that's GEM's approach. That's how you harness the community. That's what's possible in an open organization as opposed to a company which has to make sure that its intellectual property is sealed. We have this opposite opportunity to bring in the community, even people who were shooting at us, and from that, do a better job. One of the interesting things in these meetings is the sponsors, the private sponsors are invited to any of the workshops and meetings that we have. Alex Allman came from Munich Re in one of these, and he made a couple of interesting points that might resonate with you. And in the bottom one, I would say you could just as well exchange Sydney for Toronto. They have about the same seismic hazard value, according to John. And so these things are important to us. Now, I want to close making an observation of where I think GEM has made a difference and why it could make so much more. The country of Ecuador, you might have noticed its seal in the beginning, joined GEM several years ago. Capital of Ecuador, Quito, is sitting 2 miles high in the middle of a very, very active earthquake zone. No standards for construction, no seismic hazard model at all. There is Quito. 1.5 million people living on top of an active thrust fault in a basin. As we all know, that's the worst prescription we could choose. So, with GEM's help, the Ecuadorian scientists built their first ever seismic hazard model, and as a result of that model, the government has requested that they produce a building code, and because there's a model, there can be insurance. This is the virtuous cycle that GEM aims to spawn in countries like this all over the world. This is the process in which we are simply enabling those national scientists, giving them the best possible tools. They are the spokespersons to their government, and they are beginning the process that takes us from the bad building to the good building. Because even in a country of modest means, or a poor country, you can build better. Here's a building I stumbled upon in the Colombian Andes in Manizales. This is a home-built building. Nevertheless, it's light on top rather than heavy on top. It's built with strong, flexible materials, and it's filled with triangles. This building will do fine. Good engineering is not just something for the rich. If you understand the problem and if you introduce building practices, it can be something for everybody. I like to close with an image that I've always found very powerful. You're looking at a man on the right here who's about 22 years old, based on his bones, and his arms are around a woman. She's about 20 years old, and she's cradling a baby about a year and a half old. That's the baby's skull. This family was crushed by their dwelling in the 365 AD Crete earthquake. They were in the Roman port town of Eurasia. Surely, 16 centuries after this family died, the Erkmans should not be suffering the same fate, and we should be working together to give people the information to build better in places of high risk. Thank you. Yes.
Two questions. First of all, you were saying that in this GEM site, or with working with GEM, you can provide essentially options to a local government as to how they would essentially handle earthquakes or how they would handle this risk. Does this include non-structural options like building better continuity plans or emergency management plans, or is it strictly structural? That's the first question. And the second question is, this information, I assume, would also be open to individual companies or organizations in doing risk assessments and business continuity or risk management, not just insurers or countries.
Both are great questions. So in this first round of GEM, our release in 2014, it is just structural building components. So it is only the effects of shaking on buildings and what that means in terms of structural damage. If we are successful in continuing to be sponsored and supported by governments and companies, we would very much like to extend it to non-structural elements, to the effects on lifelines. We would like to extend it to the impact of earthquake-induced landslides, tsunamis. All of these are really on the loading dock. We have built the structure for this. We have built the software in a modular fashion so we can add these things, but we need to go stepwise. So you're really thinking ahead for us, and we're right there with you in wanting to do that, because the consequences of an earthquake obviously extend well beyond these immediate issues, particularly when we begin to think about the economic and social consequences. We are funding a lot of work understanding the social consequences of earthquakes and the business interruption, economic loss work. But that's really not, those are basically going to be amplifiers to the structural losses. So we would love to do more. What was your second question?
Well, the second question is, if you had a company or a single organization with locations, say, in Ottawa or Montreal, would they be able to access this in a meaningful way to determine earthquake risk at those individual locations? Okay,
another great question. So the strategy of GEM is that for use by governments, by the public, by scientists, you kind of see it here, it will be free and accessible. For use in a commercial context, there will be a sponsorship requirement. And so right now, our sponsors are, as you can see, essentially from the insurance industry. We're very hopeful of bringing in engineering and consulting companies. And on a small-scale consulting company, they would contact GEM, and we would find a way to make this financially workable. Essentially, GEM needs to make sure that it's sustainable. We've built these data sets. We want to augment them, curate them. We want to expand the software. We need to do this in a fashion that prevents this from being yet another scientific orphan that's launched into the world and then abandoned. Okay, great questions. Others?
Here's one.
Yes.
You talked about taking a group away and exploring the strengths and weaknesses and how properly these tools can be helpful going forward, and some of the conclusions. You quickly showed a summary of some of the conclusions. One of the conclusions I think I saw on that list was there too much focus on the largest possible earthquake? and that should the focus move away from that approach? As an individual, I have been increasingly thinking about the largest possible earthquake. So can you explore just a little bit more about that discussion and where thought is on that issue?
Paul, it's a great question, because an interesting element of the seismic hazard today is that we have to declare the maximum magnitude of an earthquake that can occur in a certain area on a certain fault. And the only thing we know for certain is that that's bunk. The only thing we have learned, and we learned it the hard way, is that we never know what the maximum magnitude is. Even in Chile, even where we've experienced a 9.5. And the problem is, the longer time you look, the larger the earthquakes get. So what should we be doing? The software tools basically demand this of us, and yet we know that it's unfeasible. And the argument of the builders has been, well, look, it's really just a model number. It's not that important. And these very, very large earthquakes are very rare. They're not really influencing the answer. The maximum magnitude, except in rare cases, probably doesn't affect your book of business in a major way. However, when we declare there can be no larger than an 8.5 or an 8.2, and a magnitude 9 occurs, we know what that means to the public. And they have every right to say, you don't know what you're talking about. So what we have learned is we cannot do this. We have to find a way out. There are various alternative approaches where we say beyond a certain magnitude, the rate at which earthquakes occurs gets much lower, but we can still slowly grow in magnitude. We don't know the right way to do this. We must figure it out. So this is really just something that is essential. You know, even in Cascadia, because we had a magnitude 9 in 1700, everybody says 9, and everybody says 9 is tops. Well, why not a 9.5? We've experienced that in Chile. We've almost experienced that in Alaska. Could we have a circum-Pacific earthquake? It's probably extremely remote, but there's nothing we know that says, no, it's impossible.
Just building on Paul's question a little bit, from a business point of view, everything we know about earthquakes and how we deal with it really comes out of California, right? And there, seemingly, when you do the models and you generate your EP charts and things, you see, once you get beyond 350 to 500 years, you kind of plateau out. And so the business solutions have always been generated out of what's your 250-year earthquake or your 500-year earthquake. And that's extrapolated into Canada. And yet it doesn't really seem to make sense to do so, because at the 250-year to 500-year, you're still really low on that graph, and you don't even start to plateau until you get out to like 10,000 years. And for an industry that's used to looking at a 500-year earthquake coming out of California, saying, well, let's just buy limits for 500 years in Canada too, even though we're at the wrong end of the curve. And I'm starting to think that way. Not too many other people are, and what's your perspective on that?
I think John would agree with you completely that 500 years is much too short a time horizon to look at for a place like Canada, and it's probably too short to look at a place like California too. You know, here's an example. Up until the current model, which is not yet out for California, all the models assume that there could not be an end-to-end rupture of the San Andreas. In other words, from the Salton Sea at Mexico to Cape Mendocino. And there are some reasonable arguments for this. There is a creeping section of 100 kilometers that separates the north and southern part of the San Andreas. But in even our prehistoric record, can we falsify the hypothesis that an end-to-end rupture occurred? No. Is it possible that a southern San Andreas rupture would actually be able to penetrate that creeping section or just transfer stress beyond it and trigger another one? Probably yes. Is it consequential for California? You might say, well, look, it doesn't matter. The shaking is the same. If you get 30 kilometers from the fall, whether or not it's a 1,000-kilometer long rupture or a 300-kilometer long rupture, the problem is if you simultaneously hit LA and San Francisco, the consequences are entirely different. So probably that earthquake, if it occurs, it doesn't have a 500-year horizon. Maybe it has a 5,000-year horizon, but its consequences are great. So we probably have always looked at too short a horizon. That's my judgment. I'd be interested to hear Gail or John feels about that.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. You talked about Cascadia, where the 1700 AD event is probably magnitude 9, with a certain amount of uncertainty. But you can make a case over about a 10,000-year history where you have that history, that the biggest one could easily have been 0.2 or 0.3 larger than that. Maybe we can put physical constraints to say that it can't get it much bigger than, I think 9.5 is probably too high, but it could be wrong. But you can sort of make those sorts of judgments. The other thing which I think we're leading towards is you can talk about something that is kind of a expectable loss, but there are also existential events out there which threaten the existence of a government or a country or whatever that have to be also thought about. And so, if the very existence of a company is in question because of an event which is at 1,000 years, maybe you want to give some weight to that.
So we're going to just throw in an opinion in this area.
Yes.
Gail, I hope you might jump in as well. For those who haven't read one of John's papers on this topic, great having John here on this. There was one you did, John, looking at the building code and where we went from having no earthquake risk, and then we started focusing on the 100-year risk, and then the 500-year risk, and now the 2,500-year risk. Where might we ultimately be focusing our attention? Where might we be down the road? It was a fascinating paper. And you also took that dialogue and said, that's an earthquake discussion. Why is this discussion not happening with wind and some of the other perils that are taking place? But there is some very Canadian work led by John and Gail and others have participated in aspects of this as well. Where is the ideal focus, and what does that mean for the Canadian setting? There's some good written work on this.
Part of it is just, I think that it's very difficult for people to wrap their head around the concept of a very low probability, high consequence event. People just people aren't good at that. And in general, engineers, frankly, aren't good at that. And it's been a really, really long process to try and educate people and engineers that these low probability, high consequence scenarios really do matter. And I've sort of been seeing this ever since the 1980s, and you still sort of see it today. And it's really great to hear people like Daryl, now you realize, there is now a growing population of people out there that appreciate the difference between a 1 in 500 and a 1 in 10,000 event, and that depending on where you are, that looking at the 1 in 500 event isn't going to, even if you scale it up by a factor of 2, isn't going to give you a protection against that rare event. And that's actually really been quite a sea change in thinking. I remember back in the 80s looking at an engineering presentation from an engineering firm that was designing an offshore oil platform. And, they basically said, and the earthquake load really isn't important at all. It's the wave that governs. Because, look, when you look at the 1 in 100 earthquake load and the 1 in 100 wave load, the 1 in 100 wave load is, way bigger. And so clearly it governs. And I remember saying, but, there's a difference between the shape of the curve as you go down to, what is your target reliability for this offshore stuff? Is it a 1 in 100 probability? And, they replied very confidently that, but it still didn't matter, because even if you took that 1 in 100-year earthquake loading and you multiplied it by a factor of 5, it would still be smaller than the wave loads, right? And it had never occurred to them that multiplying the 1 in 100-year earthquake load by a factor of 5 was still only going to give you something like maybe a 1 in 250 or 1 in 500, and that their actual reliability target was more like 1 in 10,000, and so that they just weren't getting there that way. And there was a huge debate that went on in the engineering community, and that starting in the 80s. But it's been really a long, long time for that particular point to sink in. I don't think that it's entirely sunk in yet, but it's coming. It's coming. And it's interesting to hear Ross's comments that, even in California, yes, there's Southern California, there's always been this idea that, because they have earthquakes fairly frequently, that they've already seen the worst.
Yeah. Yes.
I think one of the issues that you're running into when you do this is that you're doing a really great job in defining the hazard and redefining the hazard and exactly what it is, or at least as close as you're going to get with the science that there is. But risk is to some extent perceptual, and in some cases, even the word risk isn't properly defined. So once you start getting into those insurance communities and reinsurance communities, how that hazard is defined then is translated in. It's difficult quite often, as was pointed out, to take that into an actual risk statement and what a company will actually want to take on. I mean, they can do something, they will, but actually defining that risk and what it is, it becomes very, very difficult, especially with these high severity, low frequency events. So just the very concept of risk becomes difficult to define at those far tails.
A question, I'm going to take us a different direction.
Yeah.
So you shared the importance of the model and your enthusiasm and excitement to being involved in it. And some of the very compelling stories you were sharing with us focus on developing countries, or countries that don't really have a building code, don't really have any seismic analysis. Could you just share for us a moment, thinking from a Canadian perspective, getting more Canadian involvement than ever in this project? What do you see as some of the benefits for the Canadian insurance industry, for Canadian society?
It's a very good question. I get the same question, of course, from the USGS. Why would GEM be important for the USGS? We have all of this technology. And, of course, I get the same question in Japan. Fortunately, both Japan and the United States have joined. And my answer is the same one that I described as Japan not being an island, that Canada's got some very difficult problems. It's got a subduction zone with a better understanding of what its ancient history is than most, but there's still big questions. Can it be larger than 9.5? What about all the missing 8s, basically, in the record? That should really keep you guys up at night, right? Because all you need is an 8 to produce some very strong shaking, and we really don't see enough of them. And what does that mean? Is this a very unique place, or are they not in the record? When you come to eastern Canada, you have the problem of too few earthquakes in the historical and instrumental record to really give you a good sense of what the underlying cause of those earthquakes are. And so John is faced with trying to decide if little clusters of earthquakes in the east really should be linked up in a continuous kind of fault, all of which has the same expectation of earthquakes as these clusters, or if these clusters are somehow tears in a fabric which is being pulled, and we're going to continue to tear at those clusters. Those are extreme. I think John would agree that he has to make his best judgment. And when John makes his judgment, he's influenced by what he sees in Australia, in South Africa, in southern India, other places that are slowly deforming but have earthquakes. GEM's strategy is to say, okay, how can we deal with this problem? We will never have enough data in Canada. We will never have enough data in Australia. We need to group all those areas. We need to study all those areas and group them and say, okay, by sweeping them together, have we now assembled enough data to give us a better idea of what the future looks like? So my judgment is that Canada has put very, very good individuals and efforts together to do its best job, but that there is an enormous uncertainty that we all deal with, where we all could improve from this global view. Of course, John and Gail's view on this is quite important, and I cannot speak for them.
Well, it's a good segue into a question which I've sort of been afraid to ask because I really don't know the answer to this question. Maybe it's a hot potato question. So why isn't Canada in GEM?
So the problem is that it comes down to a bit of the tragedy of the commons, because GEM is effectively open, right? Canada gets it for free. Now, there's a moral obligation for the Canadian government to be involved, but the problem is that the cost, and it's about 100,000 euros, I think, for the Canadian subscription, that cost is really too big for the people around me to deal with. It's too much of a fiscal stretch. but I can't seem to push it up to a level within the government where it would be trivial, right? And there is no real, shall we say, bucket of money for Canadian involvement in international affairs that you could make an application to and say it would be in Canada's value, it would be in the world's value to actually join. So my problem is pushing something up, kind of like pushing a rope up through the hierarchy and not really getting very far.
Yes, McKenna.
If I may comment, Ross has been giving us a very nice presentation with a lot of focus on the hazard.
Yes.
And this is because he's a seismologist.
Guilty.
This is not the only part of GEM. Actually, may I say that he has been showing something which is a great piece of work, but possibly is even easier than other parts, in the sense that when you are studying something on hazard, yes, you should go back to data and so on, but at the end, if you have enough resources, you could do all this job in a room, or almost in a room, just getting data and so on. When you look into vulnerability, which is fundamental to go to risk, you cannot do that staying in a room. You need to have participants from all over the world, because no building is like those that Ross has been showing us. Each one has his own particular issues, Joint could be the weak part, columns could be the weak part, foundation could be the weak part, and the overall response, you could have damage to the structure, you might have damage only to the non-structure part. And as you know, the structure values with respect to the total value of a building is in the range of 20%. So you can have, from an insurance point of view, since we are in this room, it could be more important to look at what will be the effect of frequent small earthquakes than to the 500,000 years or whatever. It's simply because you can produce more damage, building up damage on non-structural elements, on downtime, and so on. To do all this in GEM, there are a lot of groups, and when you were showing a number, number 25 plus, 125 plus, and so on. There are a lot of groups all over the world that are actually working on vulnerability, local vulnerability, structures, buildings for the time being, but in the future, you see their exposure, vulnerability, but exposure, population, buildings, what the evaluation of damage, and then the evaluation of losses, which is actually what you're more interested in. Yes. And all these parts are also part of GEM. And OpenQuake, the program that he was showing, is not only hazard, it's also all this part. It goes all the way through, and it will be able also to produce scenarios. And on this also, if I can make another small comment on this aspect, when you are looking at a hypothesis like the one that Ross made of an earthquake that will hit at the same time Los Angeles and San Francisco, these are really scary scenarios and so on. But from the point of view of a single house, which is very close to the epicenter of a magnitude 7 earthquake, or with also close to the epicenter of the fault of a magnitude 8.5 earthquake, for that single building, the difference could be very minor. The damage could be very similar. It doesn't matter very much to the single building. The difference will be the area that will be hit. The difference will be the number of buildings that will be, feeling the same quake or the same input ground motion, or anyway, a very large big ground acceleration. So all this is not really of interest to the single owner. It is of interest of insurance companies, reinsurance companies, and government. So what I'm trying to say is that the perspective on how to use this kind of programs is very different if you're looking at your single dwelling or if you're looking at what we'll have to spend in case of a large or a small earthquake. I'm sorry to...
No, those are really good points.
Yeah, and it's a really, that size of the thing is a really interesting perspective, because that's a lot of what the issue is in Cascadia, right? That magnitude 9, those ground motions from Cascadia won't be particularly large compared to, say, if you had a crustal magnitude 7 right underneath your site, but the area will be so large that the ground motions will find the bad sites and the bad buildings. If you have a magnitude 7, you might get lucky and you have no bad actors nearby, but if you get that magnitude 9, then there will be ground motions that will find vulnerable structures.
Yes.
I'm just thinking that for non-insurers, if someone was doing, say, a business continuity assessment or a risk management assessment, that would be critical, because you'd be looking at, say, two different buildings in a location, and you'd have to do a site assessment to determine what the building was and then cross-reference to what it's sitting on. And then you could come up with some idea of what exactly the risk was to your structure.
Yes. It's interesting that I was approached by Goldman Sachs after the Tohoku earthquake by they call their Office of Global Security, which is business continuity. It's interesting that the two managing directors, one comes from the CIA and one comes from the Secret Service. So you can imagine what they consider to be their highest security issue. These people really care about keeping the operation running. And they were so well prepared for the Tohoku earthquake that they were the only trading organization that stayed open for the first 5 days after the Tohoku earthquake. And they made a fortune from that because they handled everybody else's trades. And when Hurricane Sandy was headed toward the eastern seaboard, they put up a wall of 80,000 sandbags around their building. They got 6 giant pumps, and they were the only building that had the lights on throughout the hurricane and afterwards, and they never lost a beat. And I visited them right when I was visiting another major insurance company. I will leave them their name out of this picture, and they were flooded and out of operations for months, where everybody was just working out of their homes. So here is a company that understands that the cost of that resilience planning can have a very large and immediate benefit for the company. And that's been the problem. That I think as I talk to people like this, that it's that they are not a profit center, they're a loss center. So companies tend to diminish their importance and diminish their expenditure. But these people showed, a few years apart, that they actually can make a fortune from these expenditures. And Jim wants to be able to help this organization in the sense that they could take our hazard model and our risk model, put it in their GIS for where their 75,000 employees live, and see, okay, where are top 1% of most exposed people to earthquakes in their homes and their offices? What if we changed? What if we gave them some money to move to a better apartment? What if we upgraded our buildings in those places? So we want to help not just the insurance industry, we want to help companies begin to think and make smart moves to be resilient. Paul.
In your presentation, you focused on, I think, the audiences that we most would have been interested in. So what are some of the things that insurance would be able to use from the global earthquake model? What's being done for certain countries around the world to help with a better public policy, etc.? Can you share some views about the seismic research community? So you've got data you haven't had before, you've worked on something. And can I just suggest in terms of a couple different ways that you might have a core group that's working directly with you and they have access to this and working. Or now with all this stuff, is there an active effort to reach broadly to seismic researchers, in as many as possible, and get them to work with these data? What plans do you have and what are you doing with this community?
That's a great question. And so this is very close to our hearts to provide these tools. We know that if you hand seismologists a better 100-year record of earthquakes, they will run with it. They will be publishing like crazy with it. If you build this global strain rate model, they will be working with it. And so, kind of like Tom Sawyer getting people to paint the fence, we want to encourage that process because they are both our harshest critics and our best supporters. If we give them the tools to figure out a better way to build seismic hazard and risk models, we can do that. And so we want to engage this community. We have hundreds of workshops in which these people are involved. These Powell working group meetings that I was describing involve university scientists, USGS scientists, and GEM people. And so it's very much the structure that makes most sense. And there's an extension of that too, which is that if you let's say you were to pay a vendor model company to build you a model of Argentina, Okay, what they will probably do is they'll work in-house. Maybe they will contract some perhaps excellent seismologists or geologists or engineers in Argentina to build a model. The problem with that model may be great, but the government has no ownership of it, no reason to endorse it. What we want to do instead is help scientists openly build the model with our tools, so it has a better chance of being endorsed and supported by the government. So not only are we benefiting from these scientists because they will improve the quality of what we're doing, we feel it's essential to be that those scientists are the ones that pass the message to their government, so that it can be endorsed and not seen as foreign. Yes.
I guess I'd like to reinforce that statement as well. I've recently moved to Canada from Geoscience Australia, and I guess we're working actively in the Southeast Asian region, trying to promote the GEM program and work with the local scientists in the developing world, in particular Indonesia and the Philippines, and I guess give them exposure to these tools, which I guess will hopefully have the flow-on effect that they will then go ahead and use these tools for their own benefit to develop their own models for their specific countries. So.
And, one of the problems that we have is a model that's being built in Indonesia might be built on a totally different set of assumptions than a model being built in Europe and another country. They may be the best models that everybody thinks they're building, but they're not intercomparable. So going back to the flip side of the question you just asked, if you're a reinsurance company, that's not good, because your business is to globally diversify the portfolio. And to do that, you really do need to know the relative risk in Santiago versus Tokyo versus Tel Aviv. And to get that one right, you really do need us, because we are building a globally more uniform structure and intercomparable. So we believe that there is a very strong reason why, if global diversification is important for the insurance industry, then our scientific goals align with your business goals. Yes?
I'm quite encouraged by what you're presenting here today, and I can't wait to see it.
Thank you.
But right now, when I think about global seismic hazard, the best tool that I'm aware of that I use and that I recommend is the global map from the Global Seismic Hazard Assessment Program, which has a hazard scale similar to what I saw in your maps. It ranges from low to very high, and blue to red. And it's defined based on peak ground acceleration with a 10% probability we've seen in 50 years. So I'm interested, is what you're doing completely separate from that, or is it an extension of that same work that was set up by GSHAP? And more to that is we know how they define their hazard scale, ranging from low to high, but how is yours defined?
Great question. So our goal is to utterly obsolete GSHAP, to retire it. And once again, the reason why I can say that is because Domenico Giardini, who led that effort, is a founder of GEM. And his purpose of helping to co-found GEM is just to do that. So the problem with GSHAP was that each area of hazard was calculated separately using different strategies, and they were stitched together at the borders and smoothed out. And it's not a model, it is just a map. So you can only look at this one engineering measure of the likelihood of shaking. But for the insurance industry, and for talking back to that finance minister, we need something much more flexible. That finance minister is probably interested in what could happen during his or her term in office. And for insurance, you need to know what next year's renewals are going to look like. And if you're a homeowner in California, you're thinking of your 30-year mortgage. So there's very different time frames. We've talked about very long time frames if it's a nuclear power plant, and OpenQuake has been used for a SHAC Level 3 nuclear power reactor study, calibration study. You are thinking of 15,000-year time frames. So GEM is completely flexible on the spectral measures that it's using, the time frames, things. It can create stochastic event sets used by the insurance industry, but not used by the engineering industry. So we believe it's a huge and necessary leap forward. And at the USGS, they can't wait for GSHAP to be retired. You know, for example, the hazard that was shown for Haiti was near zero. And that's because GSHAP there was based purely on the last 100 years of earthquakes. And there really had not been any. But historically, there had been some really large ones, and that was not included. So it's our hope that after GEM is fully launched in 2014, the words GSHAP will never pass your lips again.
And you have also the two other columns there.
Yes, that's right. And GSHAP stopped here at hazard. That's right. That's right. Thank you.
But you're building on top of it with using some of the same people that were involved.
Same people, yeah, different strategy, but that's right, the same people, the people who felt that that was needed then, and it was itself a very big step forward, because you're correct in saying until GSHAP was developed, aside from some internal Munich Re and Swiss Re models, there was really no global model of seismic hazard, and so it was a big step, but that's over a decade ago, and we all know around this room we can do better.
And so in my mind, I'm seeing that map that had keto and your hazard scale, again, from low to high. So can you just briefly say how you would calibrate that scale?
You mean, when you say calibrate that scale, you mean how to assign numerical values to it, or how to make sure that that is an appropriate assessment of hazard?
How do you determine, okay, what color you paint the keto?
Oh, okay. So what's been used there is an assessment of where the faults are, some judgment of the slip rate of those faults, what the historical earthquake distribution has been, what's known about the instrumental earthquakes that have occurred. So all of those have gone into the model. So there really are the same constituents that are going into any GEM model, you know, trying to get this millennial, century, and decadal view of earthquake activity.
I just wanted to ask and be clear on what's available in 2014. Is it the first column and
No.
totally the hazard, or into the
All the way.
all the way?
All the way.
All the way.
Even, you know, you'll be able to pull down a menu, choose the character of your home, and say, okay, what are the benefits from retrofitting my home? Roughly, what's the cost and what's the benefit? There'll be insurance tools. Okay, if I just pull down what my deductible is, what's the payout? What's the benefit of carrying insurance? These are not complicated insurance tools, you know, with all of the contract information that would be involved. But it's enough for a homeowner to assess, or a city manager to assess, gee, should I get insurance for my city buildings?
Ross, I think it's important also to say that in 2014 you will be right across that page, but that's not the end. You're intending this to be a living model. GSHAP basically stopped 15 years ago, right? And it's basically fossilized the way it was. But here the intent is to continue work on the hazards, continue improving vulnerability, and to have a model which grows and evolves through time.
That's right. I really appreciate this. Has been a great conversation and a great opportunity for me to hear what your reaction to this is and some of your ideas for where it should head. And I'm glad you're thinking about whether or not Canada belongs in this group. Of course, you know, John has been active. Gale's equations are being used for our ground motion prediction equation in various places. So in some sense, you're already swept up into the slipstream of GEM, but we would love to have Canada sit on our governing board, help drive this, help make sure that GEM is meeting Canada's needs for this kind of information. That's the way to do so, to really have a seat at the table.
Perhaps there might be a room for a public-private partnership to come up with the funds to put Canada into GEM.
We can have that conversation. Good.
So thank you very much.
Everybody join us in thanking Ross.